about way cash crisis works.
Talking about Venezuela once again.
Systemic important banks. They removed the one factor you do this thing here called monetary awareness.
Is the next recession?
Recession will be.
Will be a recession.
We're going to hit a recession.
The date of the next recession.
A U.S.-only recession typically lasts 8 to 10 months, but a lot of things about this particular one have not been typical. So,
a crash is coming now, whether it's 6 months from now, 12 months, 36 months, no one knows.
I go to bed every night, I dream of another recession. If you know what to do, if you have the right plan to set up, you can make a lot of money from this.
Hey there, hope all is well. So today I wanted to actually piggyback off of the video I did yesterday in regards to the possibility of having large denomination notes, with actually going back in time and actually taking a much finer look at some of the fine print on our current currency and how it evolved from 1914 up until this point here. And it's good to say that there's a couple details on those notes that most people may not have paid attention to. And so a lot of that information I'm going to share today briefly is inspired from this book right here called Money. And so it's a very detailed, very thick book, but it gives a much more in-depth understanding of how the contract between the issuer and the user has changed over the last 100 years. So today I'm going to dive into a couple of those ways in which this changed so that you can see at how we've arrived at the point we're currently at now. So right here on the screen I have actually from the uscurrency.gov, there's a little walkthrough of how we arrived to this current point where we're at now. And it says the history of the American currency. It says by tracing our currency back to the colonial era, we can explore how U.S. history has helped shape the way we design, issue, and process modern U.S. banknotes. So I'll thumb through this briefly, but yeah, it starts off as a nice little timeline. Talks about colonial notes in 1690, and we all know what happened to those. Scroll on down more, says Franklin's unique colonial notes. So Benjamin Franklin takes on counterfeiting by using Philadelphia printing firm to produce colonial notes with nature prints. So basically changing the design of them. Let's go down a little bit more. It says continental currency in 1775. Then go down here. It says the first $2 notes are continentals and are 9 days older than America. Scroll down some more. It says demand notes in 1861 to finance the Civil War. Congress authorized the U.S. Department of Treasury to issue non-interest bearing demand notes. Very important key there, non-interest bearing. Scroll down some more. It says the first $10 note in 1861 with President Abraham Lincoln's portrait on it. United States notes in 1862 says Congress authorized a new class of currency known as United States notes or legal tender notes. So you'll see that word legal tender again. It says these notes are characterized by a red seal and serial number. A national banking system. So it's 1863, Congress establishes a national banking system and authorizes the U.S. Department of Treasury to oversee the issuance of national banknotes. Federal Reserve Act 1913. In 1914, the first $10 federal note was printed. It says the notes are larger than today's notes and feature a portrait of President Andrew Jackson on the face. In 1918, the Federal Reserve Board begins issuing currency in 500, 1,000, 5,000, and 10,000 denominations. In God We Trust was placed on the notes in 1957. It says the end of large denomination bills in 1969, which put an end to the 500, 1,000, 5,000, and $10,000 notes. In 1996, there was a currency redesign with what we have today. So as you can see, it became more colorful and appealing to the eye at this point. So that gives you an idea of how we arrived at this current position with the currency we're currently using now. But what I really want to pay attention to is that if you go back, as it says here, to the very first note in 1914 from the Federal Reserve, and as I mentioned, the importance of paying attention to the fine details on each note, because at the end of the day, this note here, the notes we use are a product of a company, i.e. the Federal Reserve note, which everyone should know by now that is not a part of the federal government. It is a separate body and more of a private institution that issues currency to our government, and we use them for the purposes of our national currency when it comes to spending, saving, as well as paying taxes. But yet not too often have people actually paid attention to some of the fine print on those notes. Nevertheless, had a chance to actually go back over time to see how it's changed throughout the last 100+ years and how we've arrived to the point where we're at now, where our currency right now no longer purchases what it used to purchase. Hence the idea of all the fine print that was changed over the last several years. And more importantly, the last time the fine print was changed was in 1963. So give you an idea what's going going on here, I have the very first note that came off the printing press in 1914. And if you look closely as to what it says here, it says authorized by the Federal Reserve Act of December 23rd, 1913. So here we have just a generic $10 bill here that was put into circulation along with several other bills, because we had banknotes, we had the United States notes, as well as gold and silver coins. So there's multiple mediums of exchange for the people to use at that time. But this was the very first issuance of the Federal Reserve note. So basically the timeline I'm going to take you on now is about every 5 or 10 years or so up until the point where we're at now. So as you see, this $10 note here has Andrew Jackson on it. So if we go to the very next one here, we have a $1,000 note, which was in 1918. The fine print of this language here changes a little bit because it gets a little bit longer. And it says authorized by the Federal Reserve Act of December 23rd, 1913, and amended by the Act of September 26, 1918. So here we have a $1,000 note. So this was an introduction of the higher denomination notes that were in circulation. But of course, at that time, most people didn't have these in their pockets. It was more so for financial institutions and bankers and high net worth individuals. So not too many people had these in circulation, but just notice the fine print of how it got a little longer 4 years after the initial issuance of the first note that we looked at a minute ago. So if we go 5 years forward, here we have a United States note, a $10 note with Andrew Jackson on it still. And the fine print here says this note is a legal tender at its face value for all debts, public and private, except duties on imports and interest on the public debt. So this note here lets you know exactly what it was created for, what it was designed for, and it's a legal tender note for face value for public debts, basically primarily done in our country, as opposed to being able to be used for paying foreign debt or whatnot, which is only at that time, because we were still on the gold standard, was only in gold bullion. But a little bit more detail as far as the actual description and the usage for this particular note here amongst the population. So if we fast forward another 5 years, here we have a $500 note. And so the year is 1928. It says the redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. So here we are 14 years after the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. So the wording has gotten a lot bigger and more descriptive as to the purpose in this particular note of $500. And it says redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or the Federal Reserve Bank. So at this point in time, if you were to have a $500 note, you can take this note to the Treasury or the Federal Reserve Bank and redeem this note for lawful money. So the idea of lawful money at this time, of course, was gold and silver. So you had a choice to be able to go withdraw gold or silver to actually redeem this IOU here for physical gold and silver, which is money, i.e. lawful money. So here's another picture here of a 1928 note, and it's a Federal Reserve note. It's a $5 bill, which is a little lower, but yet read the fine print a little bit better. It says redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. So if you had a $5 bill, which is more practical, more common for most people at that time, you could take $5 bill and go to this bank and receive 5 silver dollar coins if you want it. So just the idea that this fine print here gives a much greater detail as to what this note was originally intended for, which was to be redeemable for lawful money. Fast forward a little bit more. Here we have another 1928, and this was an alternative to United States notes, the Federal Reserve note. Here we have a gold certificate. So the fine print of this one says, this certificate is a legal tender in the amount thereof in payment of all debts and dues, public and private. So here we have a golden stamp here, and it says this certificate is a legal tender for payment. And so, of course, $10 in gold coin payable to the bearer on demand. And so if you were to take this note to any institution, Federal Reserve or bank, you could receive gold coins. So here we have a silver certificate, a $1 silver certificate, and from 1935, and it says this certificate is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So the idea that this certificate, referring to the fact that you can redeem this particular piece of paper here for silver, because it says at the very bottom, $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. So if you took this one piece of paper to your bank, to the Federal Reserve, they would then give you a silver dollar. So just more fine print in the details here. And then the very next one, we have the $100,000 note with President Woodrow Wilson on it. And this is the largest denomination of the United States currency that was ever put in print. And so this note here was primarily done amongst the banks themselves. So it's never actually in circulation, even though people do have some, I'm sure, as collector's pieces. But it was a gold certificate. It says this certificate is legal tender in the amount thereof in payments of all debts and dues, public and private. What made it interesting, it says the United States of America, $100,000 in gold payable to the bearer in demand as authorized by law. So this brings me to the very last alteration in the fine print of our national currency. So prior to this note here, you had a chance to see the history from 1914 up until this current point here of a 1963 Federal Reserve note, which is the very last note where the fine print was last altered in regards to removing anything in the form of redeemability, lawful money, any particular acts or amendments that was made to the Federal Reserve Act. And so here, this is what we're left with today. It says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. And so you see how the font is a little bit bigger so that it fills in that same gap there, where I assume that at that time, most people did never pay any real attention to the fine print of those notes. And notice how it also changed along the way, because shortly thereafter, silver certificates were removed from circulation as well. And so since this time here, along with having United States notes in circulation, we're down to just two, with Federal Reserve notes and the United States notes here. And so this note here is what we have today. So I typed in the most recent dollar just to see what would pop up. So the note that popped up is a 2003 Federal Reserve note. And as you can see here, the fine print hasn't changed at all. It says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So the question you might be asking yourself is, why did you show me this entire history of the Federal Reserve note with the fine print and things of that nature? And it has to do with the idea that the initial introduction of the Federal Reserve note was designed to be a mediary between our current monetary system at that time, which was using gold and silver at that point. And so over the last 100+ years, the Federal Reserve, as well as our government, has weaned the public off of the idea of even considering gold and silver being lawful money, because up until 1963, you can actually take those notes to an institution, whether it be the Federal Reserve Bank or down to the Treasury or just to your local bank, and redeem those in regards to being able to actually give those notes back to their initial owners, to their rightful owners, in exchange for you being able to receive your lawful money, i.e. gold or silver. And so at this point today, all we have now is these IOUs, these Federal Reserve notes, which are basically notes, as they say right here on the front of them, in the form of a legal tender for debts, public and private, which ultimately is just notes for us to use for taxation purposes. And so I think it's very important to understand the entire history of this fine print, because in the fine print lies the details of what these notes were actually intended to do. And they were more so meant to be a receipt for you to be able to go claim your lawful money or redeem them for lawful money, or i.e. what we call sound money these days here. So I think this is a very important education that more people need to be aware of. And I think it's important to be able to pay attention to the fine print of the notes. And the next time you actually look down at your national currency, really pay attention to the idea it's a note intended to be a legal tender for taxation primarily, and that it's up to you as an individual, as a citizen, to be able to be aware of the importance of making it redeemable. But more importantly, since it's not lawfully required that these notes be redeemable, it's up to you to allocate some of these Federal Reserve notes to make them redeemable, so that you can acquire on your own some precious metals or things that have value. Because as you've noticed, 100+ years, these pieces of paper here haven't really retained their purchasing power much. And it's good to say in the days ahead, they won't do the same either. So other than that, I would love to hear your thoughts on this whole subject matter here. Leave a comment down below. Make sure you guys tune in tonight for an RTD Live Talk at 9:30 Eastern Standard Time with my guest, Jose Nino, as we talk about what events happening in Venezuela, as well as other aspects of the economy. Other than that, enjoy your day.